My freshman astronomy professor was the conservative Jew. I saw him at Shabbat services when I went there one time, probably the only time I went. And he gave a closing lecture in the spring of my freshman year comparing the Big Bang, circa 1977, of course, to what's in the first chapters of Genesis. Now, imagine an astronomy professor doing that today would end up in front of the dean, right? But 1977. So that was all very interesting. But I did. I thought, religion is something. I'm going to be an astronomer. I'm going to work on space. We're going to explore the universe. I don't really. Religion is sort of something that's put to the side. But I never lost a belief in God. I always believed in God.
Hi, welcome to the Society of Catholic Scientists podcast. I am your co-host, Dr. Dan Keebler, and joined with my co-host, Stephen Barr. And our guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lunine, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at the Jet Propulsion Lab, NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab that's at Caltech. He's also a professor of planetary science at Caltech. And he's been involved in a number of missions as a scientist, the Cassini mission to Saturn, the Juno mission to Jupiter, and also with James Webb Space Telescope. He's actually a Caltech alumnus, got his PhD there, spent a lot of his academic career at Cornell, and recently retired from there and moved to Caltech just this past summer, if I'm correct on that. And then Jonathan also was one of the founding members of the Society of Catholic Scientists and was on the founding board of the Society of Catholic Scientists. So, Jonathan, good to have you on.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Dan. And good to see you, Steve.
Good to see you, John.
So just to get started, I think a lot of little kids want to be an astronaut and study space. So is this something that you knew from an early age that you were interested in planetary science, astrophysics, and or was this something that it came on later in your life, maybe in college? Do you know from the very beginning that's where you were headed?
I did. When I was a little kid, I had the Golden Book of Astronomy, which was given to me by my parents. When I was only 6 or 7, my father bought me George Gamoff's book, 1, 2, 3, Infinity, which was a little bit tough for me at that age. And my mother complained that it would ruin my eyes. It did, of course, because the type was so small. And I lived close to the Hayden Planetarium at that time. So if I could get my cousin or my mother to take me there, it was always just an amazing experience, transformative experience. This, at the time, it's no longer this way, but it had this green dome and brick building, and you walked in and it was sort of like a temple of astronomy with figures painted on the ceiling in the ticket office, famous astronomers. And then, of course, there was the room with the mechanical orrery, the model of the solar system. And finally, the Sky Theater with the Zeiss projector that rose up from the center of the circular theater, kind of like a kind of a mechanical deity, and projected thousands of stars on the inside of the roof of the dome. It was just an amazing experience. So yeah, those are all transformative for me.
Yeah, and so as an undergraduate, you're in this discipline. Did you know that you wanted to do your PhD and move on to academia or work in industry, or what got you down the career path that you did after you knew, hey, I want to do sort of planetary science, astrophysics?
Yeah, I didn't want to. So I knew I didn't want to work in industry. My model really was an academic, because when I was a teenager, I had read a book by Carl Sagan. It was actually his first sole-authored book called The Cosmic Connection, published in 1974. And I wrote to him after I read the book, and he wrote back on how to become an astronomer and all that. So So that was really kind of career deciding, although the 70s were such a terrible time for basic research that there was a short period when I thought maybe I'd want to be a medical doctor instead. But then I heard a talk in New York City by Frank Drake, another famous Cornell professor. And that was also fascinating that I thought, no, I really want to be an astronomer, whether I can get a job or not. What turned me to planetary science in particular was the Voyager 1 flyby of Jupiter in 1979. Voyager 1 and 2 were launched in 1977. In 1979, spring of 79, I was a junior at the University of Rochester. I subscribed to Sky and Telescope, which still exists, amateur astronomy magazine. And on the front cover of the March issue was a far encounter picture of Jupiter taken by Voyager 1. And it was, of course, today it would, Juno images just are much, much better than the Voyager image of Jupiter. But at the time, it was amazing. It was more than you could get through a telescope. And I thought, this is what I wanted. I want to be involved with spacecraft. I want to be involved with robotic exploration of the solar system. Kind of given up by that point on being an astronaut. And so that affected what graduate schools and graduate programs I went to. So the one I went to at Caltech was not a physics and astronomy program. It was in the geological and planetary science division, even though I minored in physics and I actually took general relativity of all things from Richard Feynman, which is sort of an odd combination because Kip Thorne was on sabbatical. But that influenced my trajectory, and I ended up with a PhD in planetary science.
Wow, was Feynman's approach very mathematical? I mean,
it was completely mathematical. There wasn't an iota of geometry in it. Wow. And he didn't use Misner, Thorne, and Wheeler. He used Steven Weinberg's book.
What year was that?
That was that would have been the fall of 1980. Fall of 1980. Okay. Yeah. So least action principles and all that sort of thing. So, yeah.
So were there a lot of different places to do planetary science PhDs at the time, or has that changed now in terms of is that still a rare department to have that, or is that?
It's no longer quite so rare. It was rare at the time, and planetary science was still this sort of bastard child of astronomy and geology, and astronomers, sort of stuck their noses up in the air about it, and geologists as well, because the astronomers said, well, this is not real astrophysics or astronomy, and the geologists said, well, these people don't know how to pick up a rock hammer and go off for 2 months into the field. That was not true. There were some who did. But yeah, it was kind of at a crossroad. And so there weren't very many places at the time, but now there are more. And it's become, of course, one of the most exciting fields of science because of the results of robotic exploration.
So in your, when did you start getting involved in some of the missions to like Jupiter and Saturn, and what was your role sort of in doing those?
So academically right away, I showed up at Caltech in the fall of 1980, and the first thing that a professor in the division, I forget who it was, said to me was, there's this professor in physics, math, and astronomy. That was Caltech has divisions, not departments. And he has these data from the Viking orbiters, which were orbiters that delivered the landers to Mars and were observing from Mars orbit, data of Phobos and Deimos, infrared data. And he hasn't analyzed them. And of course, undoubtedly, he had promised NASA he would. And so he needed a victim, aka a graduate student, to actually analyze the data. What I didn't realize was that he didn't have any calibration data. So, first of all, it's on these big strip charts. This infrared signatures are written with these pen charts somewhere. And so he hands me all of these and no calibration data. So, no idea, really what the numbers meant, even what the relative numbers meant. So I got sent off to JPL to find the calibration data. And that was my first experience at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory as a graduate student. And it was a little bit of a sort of a pilgrim's journey. And eventually I found somebody there who could help me with finding the calibration data. And it was all, yeah, I analyzed it with the help of another grad student actually, and this other professor, and we published it, and that was it. So that was the first. The first official role I had on a mission was after I graduated and got my PhD, and I was then at the University of Arizona as an assistant professor, and it was to be a guest investigator on the ultraviolet spectrometer for Voyager 2 Neptune. So, Voyager 1 did Jupiter and Saturn, Voyager 2 did Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and then Neptune, reached Neptune in 1989. Both are still operating. The ultraviolet spectrometer was designed to look at emission from Neptune or reflection from Neptune and Neptune's moon Triton at wavelengths shorter than what our human eye sees. And the principal investigator of that instrument was at Arizona. And he actually wanted me to help fight for his observations because there's a little competition at Triton as to who would get what time. So that sent me back to JPL actually in 1989, and I got to meet Ed Stone, who was the project scientist for Voyager, and he held a sort of a round table where the advocates for the different observations would make their pitch. And so I did that, even though in the end I actually liked what the other guys were going to observe, not what we were going to observe. But it had a happy ending. They were able to fit both sets of observations in. So that was my first, Voyager Neptune.
Were you a postdoc or a senior
I was
faculty?
so in 1989, I was a assistant professor. I graduated in 85, was a postdoc for about a year and a half, became assistant professor in 1986 at Arizona Lunine Planetary Lab. So,
yeah.
So that was the first.
A lot of these missions, there's a lot of fights over who gets to do what observations are most important and what we want to do. And how does that work? Is this a big room? Everybody gets into a shouting match.
Yes, it's a big room where if it's not done right, it's a big room where people get into a shouting match. And that was actually what happened with Cassini, which was the next mission I was involved in. And I was involved in that from the time that it was being proposed in the mid to late 1980s. The Voyager results at Saturn, Voyager 1 and 2 at Saturn, were so fascinating, 1980 and 1981, that both the US and Europe wanted to go back and put an orbiter in orbit around Saturn and land something on Saturn's moon Titan, which has this very dense atmosphere. And we learned later from Cassini has actually lakes and seas of liquid methane. So the problem with Cassini was that it was a bad time for the NASA budget, a little bit like today. And the original design for Cassini had a scan platform where you could take the remote sensing instruments and point them in different directions while the antenna was pointed at the Earth, or the magnetic field and plasma instruments were making observations in other directions. So the first thing that happened once Cassini became a real mission at NASA and European Space Agency was NASA said you have to save, I forget how many, I think it was over $100 million. It may have been more than that, or we'll cancel you. So the scan platform was very expensive, and the project took the scan platform off. And so now the whole thing was like this giant oil drum, about 8 or 9 feet tall, with a 3-meter mirror at the top. So a 3-meter reflector antenna at the top, communications antenna. And the instruments were body mounted, so that in order to make observations, if this is coffee cup was Cassini, it was a little bit longer than that with an antenna on top. You had to point in one direction for the remote sensing instruments, point the other way to get the data back to the Earth, point another way for the plasma instruments. And so it initially, during the planning, JPL was very conservative about what they thought they could do with the spacecraft. And so there were all these arguments about who got what data, when, especially for Titan. There were multiple flybys of Titan that were used actually to change the orbit. Titan was used as a kind of a slingshot as the spacecraft orbited around Saturn. And finally, a kind of a brilliant economist at Caltech came up with this idea for a market where the different instruments would essentially barter with three things. One was their budgets. The second was their data allocation, and I think the third was data storage or power. And so that kind of ended those arguments because people could barter their resources for different observations, and so that was brilliant. In the end, JPL learned how to operate their own spacecraft better than they had advertised, and so every flyby of Titan was a kind of an aerial ballet where the spacecraft was turning and twisting to point in different ways and different directions. And we got an enormous amount of data over 13 years from 2004 to 2017 when the spacecraft finally ran out of fuel and had to be disposed of in Saturn. It was a great mission. It's a fantastic mission.
Yeah. So just for a layperson, what kind of data do you get? And then what's the majority of the data? Are you picking up spectroscopy data? Is it like to identify compounds that are there in the atmosphere? Is that sort of what these missions are looking at?
So the easiest way to think about it is to imagine that you're an extraterrestrial that's arriving at the Earth, and you want to learn about the Earth, but you don't want to interfere with the politics or the culture of the Earth. So you want to just do this by remote sensing. You want to make these very stealthy flybys of the Earth. So, what are the things that you want to know? Well, you want to know what the nature of the surface is, how warm it is, whether there's liquid. You want to know about the atmosphere, how the atmosphere and the surface exchange energy and materials. So yeah, you do spectroscopy from the ultraviolet to the visible to longer wavelengths in the infrared. You would use radar to penetrate the clouds of the Earth. That's actually been done to map the geology of the Earth without having to worry about clouds with so-called synthetic aperture radar. We did that for Titan. Titan's covered in haze, and so the radar was necessary. You might do what's called a radio occultation, where you send a radio signal through the atmosphere of the Earth to determine the temperature versus altitude from how that signal is refracted. And we did that at Titan and Triton and Saturn and all of that. So those are the kinds of things you might want to know about the magnetic, and you certainly want to know about the magnetic environment around the Earth, what protects the atmosphere, and that would be the Earth's magnetic field, and how are charged particles from the sun trapped and accelerated by those field lines. You'd make measurements with a magnetometer and plasma instruments, and again, exactly the same thing for Cassini at Titan and Saturn, and Galileo at Jupiter for that matter. So those are the kinds of measurements that are made, and so we try to learn things very much along the lines of what we know about our own home planet.
So is Titan? It's fairly large, right? It's sort of the size of a planet, like.
Yes, it's the size of Mercury. Planet.
Does
Mercury.
it have I forget these things, but what's the surface like? Is it a rocky surface, or is it mostly ocean?
So it's not rocky, it's icy, but it's very complicated surface. So it is larger than the planet Mercury. It's just slightly smaller than Jupiter's moon Ganymede, which is the largest moon in the solar system. But Titan has a very dense atmosphere, mostly molecular nitrogen, just like our own air, but it's very cold there. And so water is completely frozen out. And instead of water, methane, or for our European British listeners, methane, is the working fluid. It forms clouds, it forms rain, it has carved out gullies on the surface. So what is the surface made of? Well, we know from the density of Titan, its mass divided by its volume, that it's about twice the mass of water. So that's a little bit low in density for a completely rocky body. It's probably about 40 or 50% ice and 50 to 60% rock, depending on how things are arranged. The whole body. That's the bulk object. So you can imagine this thing because ice is less dense, that the ice forms a mantle around a core of rock on Titan, and the ice goes down, because it's such a big object, goes down, 1,000 kilometers or more. And so the surface presumably is water, ice, but what's actually measured from remote sensing and also from the Huygens probe, which was the European contribution that landed on the surface of Titan, the surface isn't water ice. It's some sort of organic material. There are these dunes made of solid organics. There are lakes and seas in the high latitudes that, with the Cassini radar, in a kind of an interesting, almost like doing bathymetry with a sonar device, but this is with radio. We know the depths of those seas, and we know their composition from how much the radio signal is absorbed by those lakes and seas, and they're methane and ethane.
So you say seas and lakes,
Yeah.
but there is liquid.
They are liquid.
Yep,
Methane at the surface temperature of Titan, which is about minus 290 Fahrenheit, is a liquid. Ethane, which is the product of methane in the upper atmosphere where sunlight breaks the methane apart, is also a liquid. And they form these seas on the surface. The largest sea is the size of the Caspian Sea on the Earth, and the second largest sea is about the surface area of Lake Superior.
This is probably jumping ahead of what we were going to discuss, but I'm just curious, is Titan one of the places that people speculate could conceivably be a place that life evolved, or
So it would have to be a really exotic form of life. Right now, there is evidence for liquid water, but very deep in Titan's interior, just by looking at how Titan's mass shifts as it moves in its orbit around Saturn. Its orbit is not a circle, it's an ellipse, so it gets tidally squeezed. So there is liquid water, but it's way, way down, probably not accessible to the surface. The liquids on the surface are methane and ethane. Is there some form of chemistry that could evolve into biology in that kind of an environment? And the answer is we don't know. It's a fascinating question. There have been some very talented chemists that have proposed schemes for kind of methane life on Titan, but it's not one of the places we would go to look for life as we know it. Those would be Jupiter's moon Europa, which has a near-surface ocean, and Saturn's moon Enceladus, which also has a liquid water ocean under the surface.
Which I know you're very excited about.
Well, I love Titan as well. I mean, Titan was, how I got involved in Cassini, and I love Titan. I love Enceladus. I mean, Europa, I'm involved in 2 instruments on Europa Clipper, which right now is sitting on a rocket in a hangar, riding out the Hurricane Milton, and hopefully will be launched next week or over the weekend. So I love all these places. They're all fascinating potential sites for some kind of life, or possibly just prebiotic.
It sounds like in your field you get sort of emotionally attached to certain planets.
People do, actually. I gave a talk at a conference a couple of decades. Goodness, when was that? Probably 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. In which I argued we should go back to Titan before we actually go to Europa, because it was difficult to get a Europa mission going politically. And at the end of my talk, which was this invited talk, I noticed that people had been drifting out of the room, and they hadn't been drifting out to go to a bar and drink. They had been going out to the lobby where someone was handing out Europa buttons. And so when I left the talk, there was this enormous crowd of colleagues who were all wearing Europa buttons.
Free Europa.
Free Europa. Yeah, so I felt a little bit like Kamala Harris at a Trump rally or something.
The lobby that goes behind the scenes about what mission.
This is really fascinating.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, I was interested in knowing, Steve, if you and Jonathan knew each other before you formed the Society of Catholic Scientists, and how you guys got together on the board.
I can say something a little about that, and then Jonathan pick up on it. But I had written, there was a young fellow at America Magazine, which is this Jesuit magazine. He was an editor or something for the online version of it. And he had asked if he could interview me. about science and faith. And so I had given him an interview. And then I got an email at some point after that, and Jonathan emailed me. I didn't know Jonathan, and I'm in a completely different field. So I didn't know of Jonathan because I'm in a very different field. And so anyway, Jonathan said he had read my interview and he liked it and was interested. And so we started talking back and forth by email. And I found out that Jonathan is a convert. I don't know if that came up already in this interview, but Jonathan was at that point a recent convert to the faith. And as we talked more, he said, my pastor here at Cornell has suggested to me that I start an organization for Catholic scientists. And I said, that's something that has sort of been in the back of my mind for many years. And then Jonathan said, why don't we do it together? And so I had sort of assumed this would be in the eschatological future that this would happen. I didn't really realistically plan on doing it, though I had secret list of Catholic scientists who I knew they could be the core of it. But I didn't actually plan to do it. I thought maybe after I'm retired or something. So John said, why don't we join forces and do it together? And that was the genesis of the Society of Catholic Scientists.
That's right. And from my end, I had read this interview with Stephen Barr, and the things that he had, as Steve just said, I could see there we were of like minds, and so I did reach out and email Steve, and the rest was as he said.
And Jonathan said, so I was sort of on a glide path to retirement at that point. I mean, I was over the hill as a researcher, in my own estimation anyway. And Jonathan was, of course, very much in mid-career. And he said, I have to warn you about one thing. I have a very large grant that's pending. And if it gets funded, I'm not going to have a lot of time to do things. So you might have to do a lot of the sort of grunt work for starting it. And he said, and I said, that's fine. He said, and I'll be the prod, which I needed. I need a prod. Yeah. Or I'll never get anything. So and of course it was funded. And since I was sort of over the hill as a researcher, I was able to spend more time doing, stuff like incorporating and stuff like that.
Getting the meetings going and so forth. So, John, you mentioned...
But before you go on, I just have to say that, that is accurate, but it also reflected my own naivete, because I thought that setting up an organization just involved a lot of grunt work. But we wanted a Catholic organization. We wanted something that was in communion with the church. Right. And that required, first of all, some connections with a diocese or archdiocese, which Steve had. And the other was some rather nimble negotiations. So it was not grunt work, it was expert work. And so when I said I wanted time to help, this was kind of a blessing, because I didn't really know how to do these things.
Neither did I, and I'd never incorporated anything. And unlike you, I'd never run anything. I'm just a pencil and pad guy. Where Jonathan's in a field where there's large collaborations and you're working in big groups and there's a lot of money and resources involved. And I'm just sitting there with pen and paper solving equations and things. But it actually, getting the approval of the church was not a big deal. Once we incorporated, I found that I just talked to people in other Catholic organizations, and it was not, you fill out a form and it's not that, and we got recognized by the church as an official Catholic organization. So we're legit. And also by means of that, we're tax exempt because we're connected to the church. Yeah.
Well, Jonathan,
I think the one thing I contributed that probably is that I had a record of writing a lot about science and faith for various publications like First Things.
Yes.
And so I had name recognition among Catholics, and that included some Catholic scientists who had read some of my articles. And so that actually gave us some, that's where when we started, there were people who already there was that connection, and that helped us actually round up some of our initial members. So I think that is something which maybe providentially going.
So, Steve, you mentioned that, Jonathan was a recent convert when the society started. So, Jonathan, if you just sort of take us through what brought you into the Catholic Church and where you're coming from.
Sure, absolutely. So I think Steve and I emailed each other in 2014 or 15. Is that right?
Probably around there, yeah.
And I was baptized and confirmed in 2007. So I had been Catholic for 7 years at that point. So I was born and raised in a Jewish family in New York. My father's side was conservative Jewish. In fact, his sister, upon learning that her daughter, my first cousin, was engaged to a Catholic man, my aunt and uncle sat Shiva for her, which actually caused her to break off the engagement, and she ended up marrying a Jewish man, wonderful man, who we're good friends. But it really worked, pretending that your daughter's dead really worked. On my mother's side, they were very Reform Jews. In fact, my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, who passed away a year before I was born, believed that religion was more or less the root of all of humankind's problems. So, he was not all religious. So it was kind of a mixed, even though both sides were Jewish, kind of a mixed upbringing. My parents belonged to a beautiful Reformed synagogue, Central Synagogue in New York City for a few years. Then my father lost his business, and we couldn't afford it anymore. So I got some Jewish upbringing, but I also spent a lot of time reading our family Bible, which was a King James Bible. That apparently was not all that uncommon among Jewish households in the East Coast in particular, because these were beautifully made, they're beautifully bound, and they had these, color plates of Renaissance art and all that. So they were very popular. So of course I was, I'd flip to the New Testament, flip back to the Old Testament. It was all very mysterious to me. I'd look at the pictures. And then something happened. So my father had a very troubled life. It turned out he was an alcoholic and a pill abuser, and that's one of the reasons why, probably the reason why he lost his family store, our family store, his father's store, Haberdasher, and ended up in businesses that were not entirely legal and borrowing money from people that you shouldn't borrow money from, and so forth. And so it was a bad time. And around the time that he died, probably of complications of alcoholism, he wasn't living with us anymore. I had an experience in a dream in which I met Jesus Christ, not standing there like in a, one of these paintings that you'd see, but I was in a church and I turned around and his presence was there. And so, this had a big emotional impact on me at the time. I told my mother about it. She was actually thinking of converting, so her response was, "Well, what more do you need?"
How old were you
I was
in this?
13 or 14.
Yeah.
So, that response, I love my mother. She's a wonderful mother. But when she said that, it kind of made me shut up. I shut myself up on this. It wasn't really a way. I couldn't open myself up to this. And so I put this experience aside. And
she wasn't really encouraging you. She was trying to discourage you, or
no? I think she was trying to encourage me.
Oh, I see.
She was thinking of it herself, but it was so embarrassing when I told her. It was just embarrassing to. I realized I kind of made a mistake in telling her about this dream because.
Had you read parts of the New Testament before that?
I'd read parts of the New and Old Testament. I'd watched King of Kings with Jeffrey Hunter. I had. I think I'd probably visited St. Patrick's Cathedral. My mother, in her career before her marriage, was a rockhead at Radio City Music Hall, precision tap dancer. And because all the other Rockettes were Catholic, she would just go with them to St. Patrick's in between the shows when they would go to Mass. And she kind of converted late in life, but never really went all the way. Was never baptized, but she was always sort of dancing on the edge. But at the time when I was teenage,
no pun intended.
No pun intended. So, at that time I was 13 or 14. She hadn't done that yet. But yeah, this experience, obviously, there were inputs fed from the Bible, from King of Kings. But it was definitely something that was more than a dream, was really how I perceived it. But I put that all aside. And over my adult life, as a graduate student, I went with a couple of friends to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services at their synagogue. And then when I moved to Tucson and I met my wife to be, Cynthia, she was exploring a very non-traditional Methodist church in Tucson because she had been brought up in a very conservative fundamentalist Christian household in rural New Mexico. So she was seeking. And I had gone to the same church, coincidentally, to a wedding, and I was very impressed with it. And long story short, we became members of it, but I still wasn't baptized and confirmed. In fact, it was so non-traditional that, unlike standard Methodist churches, where when you join, you say what is more or less the Apostles' Creed, that step wasn't there. But I learned a lot from that pastor. He was a brilliant, now retired pastor. He was steeped in Teilhard de Chardin, in Augustine. He had really a great depth of knowledge and was a very motivational speaker. I had come to know the Jesuit astronomers of the Vatican Observatory because they were at the University of Arizona. That was their Western headquarters. Their Eastern headquarters was Rome. These are astronomers who are also Jesuit priests and brothers. And I know the director, Guy Consolmagno, very, very well from my graduate school days. And what impressed me about them was the way they were able to live lives of real religious faith and do science harmoniously. I'd never really seen that before, and that made a big impression on me as well.
Did you see there was an inherent conflict there in your life? Did you sense that in any way, that, or was it just sort of didn't think about that too much, how faith and science moved together before that?
Yeah, I just didn't think too much about it. I mean, there wasn't a lot about that. I remember my freshman astronomy professor was a conservative Jew. I saw him at Shabbat services when I went there one time, probably the only time I went. And he gave a closing lecture in the spring of my freshman year comparing the Big Bang, circa 1977, of course, to what's in the first chapters of Genesis. Now, imagine an astronomy professor doing that today would end up in front of the dean, right? But 1977. So that was all very interesting. But I did. I thought, religion is something. I'm going to be an astronomer. I'm going to work on space. We're going to explore the universe. Religion is sort of something that's put to the side. But I never lost a belief in God. I always believed in God. But what God was, for a long time, I was probably a nominal deist. I thought, okay, there was some force that formed the universe that we can't understand. But this experience I had when I was 13 stuck with me. And then after our second sabbatical in Rome, coming back to Arizona in 2006, the summer of 2006. So, of course, I got married. I didn't tell you all that. Got married in 1986. We have one son. We actually had our son baptized at this Methodist church in Tucson, but I was not. So 2006, I'm 47 years old at that point. I've been a full professor for a long time. Second sabbatical in Rome, had known the Vatican astronomers, had worked with them on one of their summer schools during that sabbatical. And I'm sitting in my living room back in Arizona. We lived about an hour south of Tucson. We're closer to Mexico than to Tucson. And I'm just sitting in my living room all by myself one morning, and the thought just came to me that it was time for me to stop doing what I ascribed to my mother, which was dancing on the edge of this pool, and
Yeah.
just commit myself to what I really believed. And what I really believed was Christian belief that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that God is Trinitarian, is triune, I should say, and it was just so hard for me to kind of express that. But in that moment, that all came out. I called up a friend of mine who was our son's pediatrician, who was a devout Catholic, Bill Madden. And I said, Bill, would you think I was crazy if I told you that I think I want to be a Catholic, that I am a Catholic? And he said, no, not at all. And he was very nonchalant about it. And he introduced me to the associate pastor at the Newman Center on campus, a great guy named Father Miguel, who, despite the name, is not Hispanic, but
That's
gave
interesting.
wonderful, spent a lot of time in New Mexico, and started the RCIA process with the Dominican Fathers of the Western Province. They ran the Newman Center, and there were two sisters there, Sister Diane and Sister Renille, who were both wonderful. Bill became my sponsor and godfather, and he also sent me, which caused the Dominicans to raise their eyebrows a bit. He sent me a copy of this textbook by McBrien called Catholicism,
Oh, right.
which had been criticized by the Catholic, the U.S. Catholic bishops, right, for various reasons. McBrien had been the president of Notre Dame, and brilliant man.
Well, he'd been the head of the theology department.
Head
there.
of the theology department. That's right. Yeah. It was a great book. It's 1,400 or 1,500 pages long, and I read it. Bill sent it to me right away. I read it cover to cover that summer, and sure, there are parts of it that probably are not quite as orthodox as they should be, but the whole book brought Catholicism alive to me, and I had chosen Catholicism rather than Protestant because of the very long intellectual history that I'd become aware of thanks to this Methodist minister, David Wilkinson, at this non-traditional Methodist church in Tucson. And he was the one who introduced me to all of that. He was shocked when I said I was going to be a Catholic. He mumbled something in Latin, and that was it. Anyway, so that's the story. It's a long story. I went through the RCA process, baptized and confirmed on Holy Saturday in 2007 at the Newman Center at the University of Arizona.
Wow.
Yeah, that's great. You said that your pastor there with his expertise on that, so the Catholic tradition there had an influence on you. Just wanted in moving towards the Catholic faith, did the Jesuit astronomers that you mentioned, they have a big influence on you?
It was all reinforcing. It was Wilkinson, the Methodist minister. It was the Jesuit astronomers. It was the time we had spent in Italy in these churches that are steeped in this history that is, everywhere in the art, on the walls, in statues. And, it isn't just that it's very pretty and it smells nice. It exudes the Holy Spirit. It exudes this, long history of 2,000 years that has a continuity to it that I really think no other Christian denomination has. I'll go out there and say that. I may get some hate mail, but that's
no.
right.
I mean, so I was going to ask you a question about that. It seems I have the sense that people who are coming from outside of Christianity, to begin with, have a better perspective because they see Christianity, the history of Christianity, and it's sort of perhaps more evident to them that the Catholic Church has this long continuity and is sort of the original form of Christianity, whereas people coming from within Christianity often don't see that sweep of history. Is that would you say
I think that's true. My in-laws, I had a wonderful relationship with my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, and they're really wonderful people, very devout, fundamentalist Christians, part of the non-denominational Church of Christ. My wife's father was the sort of ran that church. He wasn't the minister, but he ran it more or less. So when I announced my conversion and that I was going to become Catholic, my father-in-law cried tears of joy.
Oh, okay.
My mother-in-law kind of got a strange look on her face and said, "Why Catholic?" And there are a lot of so we after both of them passed away, we dug through, my wife and I, a lot of their things, and there were a lot of tracts, tracts, that they had saved from like the early part of the 20th century when they were younger, all about Catholicism being the Catholic Church being the whore of Babylon, essentially tracing that root
Yeah,
out.
right.
Why Catholics are not Christian, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
wife's family also had some Mormon cousins, a Mormon branch to them. So there were tracts on why Mormonism, wasn't Christianity. That's probably a stronger case to make, I would say. But it was, they lived in a world that had this perspective that
Right.
came from this kind of American evangelical movement of the 19th century. And you're right, the historical perspective, if I wanted to be euphemistic, is very different. If I wanted to be transparent, I'd say was very limited, the historical perspective. Yeah,
So you were at Cornell for many years, a professor at
right.
Cornell, and as you said, one of the people you read as a kid was Carl Sagan, one of his Carl
Right.
Sagan's books, who was an eminent astrophysicist at Cornell. Did you read his? I mean, he wrote some books. I think was it Cosmos, where he talks about religion,
Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah. I've
probably
read.
not
Yeah.
a totally positive way. Did that
Right.
have an effect on you when you were young?
No. So I read some. So at the time, I read The Cosmic Connection, 1974. I think the next thing that came out was The Dragons of Eden, which was a book that he and Anne Druyan wrote. His collaborator and wife. She is, I should say, key writer of Cosmos and the reboots. That was all about evolution and how our behavior is essentially a kind of a superposition of the earlier kinds of animals that have arisen, the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, that kind of thing. It was not to me as inspiring as as Cosmic Connection.
Okay.
Even Cosmos itself, I have to say that the one book that I thought was the fresh, original, and still fresh inspiration really is The Cosmic Connection and Extraterrestrial Perspective, because it gave a kind of a vision for humankind as a species that would move out into the cosmos eventually and become a multi-planet species, and it did it without a lot of polemic about religion. I think some of that came later in Carl's life. So to complete my biography, I was at the University of Arizona until 2010. I spent 2 years teaching in Rome. There was an opportunity that came up. I did a leave of absence. During that time, Cornell came and snatched me away from Arizona. To his credit, my department head, who's now passed away, Mike Drake at Arizona, was extremely gracious about all this, and he's a wonderful man who had no vindictiveness whatsoever, and so I was very grateful for that. So I spent 13 years at Cornell before I retired from there in mid-August. It's interesting because I held during my time at Cornell the chair that Carl Sagan held. And so people would sort of associate that. But my views on religion were very different from Carl's views. He famously said the only intellectually honest position to take is agnostic, because we don't know, really whether God exists. Now, if you read Thomas Aquinas, you might disagree with that, because his 5 demonstrations, at least 1 or 2 of them, I think, are, really compelling, maybe all 5. exercises in natural reason, demonstrating the existence of God, or at least the extreme likelihood that God exists from the point of view of logic and what he called natural reason. But leaving that aside, it wasn't until I got to Cornell that I really kind of came out as a Catholic, if you will. I was still at the University of Arizona for 2 more years after I converted. I went to Mass, of course, but I didn't do anything in terms of give lectures on science and faith. In Italy and Rome, everybody's a Catholic, but no one really believes. It's this, everyone's a cultural Catholic, very many believers. So, there wasn't a lot of stimulating conversation outside of the Jesuits. But when I got to Cornell, that's when I started to feel that I really needed to do something, that there was a purpose to this, and that for me to simply be a quiet Catholic was a waste. And that's why I reached out to Steve after reading that interview, that it was just an internal movement that I needed to do something. So the Society of Catholic Scientists was really a wonderful, and is a wonderful journey. I'm a life member of it. And then at Cornell, I started a series on science and faith that was modeled after one that one of the Jesuit astronomers at Arizona had put together. And during that, a graduate student in biophysics came up to me and said that he wanted to start a chapter of the Thomistic Institute at Cornell. And I said, the Thomistic what? And he explained this to me. Coincidentally, we were having our scientific conference that year, our Society of Catholic Science, a science conference that year at the Catholic University of America. Mm-hmm. And the head of the Thomistic Institute, Father Dominic Legg, knew Steve Barr. And I think it was through you that we all got invited the week before to this Thomistic Institute workshop, mostly intended for graduate students. And so I went out there with this student at Cornell, and it was great. It was really amazing. I fell in love with Father Dominic. He's Dominican. They're all Dominicans there in the Dominican House of Studies, where the Thomistic Institute is hosted. And so I became faculty advisor for the Thomistic Institute. We had there is still a very active chapter there, where speakers from the Thomistic philosophical and theological tradition give talks there. I've given some talks elsewhere around the country. And then finally, I about 2020 or 2021, someone named Thomas Levergood gave me a call. Thomas Levergood was the director, founder of Lumen Christi, a Catholic organization in Chicago, who Steve had contacted and had helped with the Society of Catholic Scientists. In fact, he had helped host the very first scientific conference we had in Chicago.
Lumen Christi helped fund and organize our first conference in Chicago. Yeah.
So Thomas was a wonderful man. He passed away of cancer in 2022, I think, 21 or 22. It may have been 2022. But so he calls me up and he said, Lumen Christi is writing a big Templeton grant to fund 6 nodes of Catholic thought and culture. The others all turned out to be pre-existing ones. Collegium at University of Pennsylvania, the
St. Anselm Institute
St. Anselm
Virginia
Institute,
University,
Virginia, so Cornell would be the baby. And so he talked me into this, and the experience I had watching and helping Steve start the Society of Catholic Scientists was very helpful in setting this up at Cornell, because it was the same thing about starting up a 509c, starting up a nonprofit and having it be associated with the church. So we started that up in 2022, hired an executive director. It's called COLUS, after the Latin for Hill. It's actually an acronym. It's a Cornell, I won't get the acronym right, so I'm not going to try. But it's a Center for Catholic Thought and Culture at Cornell. And we have a wonderful associate director. I'm rotating off the board in February because I'm no longer there. But that's what I've been doing. And it's been a journey that to me has been completely unexpected, together with giving talks on science and faith around the country. It was not why I converted. I had no idea that this would come up at all when I made my decision to be baptized and accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. But here it's happened.
Well, I have to say, I'm hearing a lot of this myself for the first time, and of your story, and I think it's great that you felt this when you got to Cornell, that you felt this call or to do something about it. And I wish more Catholic scientists would. Unfortunately, a lot of Catholics, this may be more true of cradle Catholics, I don't know. It may be a combination of they don't know what they can do. They may not feel equipped to do anything on science, or they might be fearful of, coming out as a Catholic. There may be various factors, or there might be complacency. I think sometimes Catholics don't know what we have, and we're just sort of too comfortable in our own Catholicism and don't understand that we have. So all of us have some obligation to do something, So, I didn't know about that you had that sort of.
Yeah. Have you had any interesting reactions from colleagues as you've done this, as you started to come out and do Catholic talk, science and faith talks? Colleagues have known you your whole life that have opened up conversations with them that have been interesting that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And it was the general reaction sort of you've seen. I'd love to hear about that. So,
yeah, the general reaction has ranged from disinterest to positive, I would say. I've gotten very few negative. I can't really think of any really negative comments that I've gotten. Part of this is that I converted late in life. I was already a tenured professor. And so to some extent that shields you from what I think earlier career, younger colleagues have to face. I know personally of a younger colleague who was at an Ivy League university. He was the only Catholic in their quote unquote theology program. And he was denied tenure, but it was open. The other faculty were I would say openly antagonistic to him during.
He was in the science program there?
No, it's theology.
Oh,
it was theology. But he was a Catholic. The others were really not religious at all. Maybe it was a religious studies program. They were all academics, but they were not believers. So I avoided that. I will tell you one story, which was that I was set to give a talk on Georges Lemaitre, the Catholic priest and cosmologist, and I've given many talks on him. I was going to give a talk on campus, second talk I gave on campus about this. And there was a snowstorm, so the talk was canceled. We rescheduled it, and the room wasn't available. So my department manager, actually, she was my associate director at the time because I was the director of the research center. She was a devout Catholic. She's passed away now, unfortunately. She said, why don't we just have it in the astronomy building? And I said, okay, fine. So we set it up for our conference room. And as a consequence of that, all of these colleagues show up because, it's a talk in the building by one of the colleagues. And after it was over, several colleagues came up to me and said, I had not really thought about Lemaitre in this way. This is all very, very interesting. And so it opened their eyes to things they hadn't thought about. And so I've had interesting conversations with colleagues who are not religious, who haven't really thought about this very much.
That's great.
I think that's my experience too. I think maybe also because when most people who know that I'm Catholic in my field of physics only found out, relatively recently. And if you already have a reputation, that, as you say, they're not going to say, oh, this guy's a good scientist, but now that we know he's Catholic, now we think he's an idiot. That doesn't happen. Right. I mean, exactly. And I think in my 40 years as a scientist, or 40 plus, I've only had 2 times where someone actually had overtly hostile reaction to that when they. So it's not, for those out there who wonder. Most scientists, at least in the physical sciences, there's not a lot of hostility in the scientific world. You don't
That's
encounter
right.
it very often.
Yeah. So in 2019, I became the chair of the department. And, so my colleagues voted unanimously for me to become the chair with full knowledge that I was a practicing Catholic who gave talks like this. And I didn't say anything about that, but it really touched me because, I knew they knew my background. And so it was, more than just sort of neutrality. It was a real vote of confidence. And I was chair for 5 years until I retired from Cornell this summer.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Jonathan, for sitting down with us. It's a very fascinating both scientific journey and a faith journey that you've shared with us. And we'll have hopefully a second episode with you where we can talk a little bit about your scientific research and the questions about life on other planets and your thoughts on that and how we do research on that. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribing, and we will notify you as future episodes become available. If you'd like to find more related content or more information about the Society of Catholic Scientists, or if you're interested in donating to support our work, please visit us on the web at catholicscientists.org.